This edition of the Ridley Report is brought to you by
WeUseCoins.com.
And President Obama is determined to match our words with our actions.
I was watching some Hillary Clinton video the other day. She was spewing some sort of hypocrisy talk about human rights in this or that place that happens to not be America. It got me thinking, why aren't foreign governments doing this for Americans? Why aren't they raising concerns about human rights in America? But then I realized they are. Or at least one of them is.
The country's oldest inhabitants are literally battling to stay alive.
It was so obvious it was staring me right there in the face. The Russian government, through its TV outlet, Russia Today. RT America actually keeps pretty close tabs on U.S. human rights. I can't get over what an evolution this represents both in media and politics. First of all, the whole concept of, like Radio Free Europe or Voice of America has been switched on its head. There was a time when there wasn't a lot of freedom of speech in the Soviet bloc, and Americans broadcast a relatively free message through its government organs. That's back when the U.S. was relatively free. But now Americans have to get their relatively uncensored news from foreign sources, just like the old Soviets had to, the Soviet citizens. This is probably the obvious change, the one that you've all noticed and been thinking about, those of you who watch my channel. But the other change is more subtle, and I noticed it as a videographer. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, if you watched any kind of foreign media, the coverage was just awful. With a few exceptions, the really developed Western world, it wasn't so bad. But there was a program called CNN World Report that used to air in the late 80s. And journalists from around the world would submit their stories, and it was just god-awful coverage. You'd never seen worse writing, you'd never seen worse videography, and I can understand how the writing would be weak with people speaking Russian people speaking English as a second language. But this was television in the rest of the world was just awful. But now, if you watch Russia Today, there are some flaws, some relatively serious flaws with Russia Today, but the videography is absolutely first rate. The production values, by and large, are first rate. There are some problems with content, and there's some problems with tone. But, most of the same problems that at least some of the same problems that people were working with in the late 80s, are still present today for RT.
Ma'am, do not move away from me. You're being arrested.
I wasn't doing anything.
I told you to leave 3, 4, 5 times.
I moved. I'm a member of the press.
A lot of the RT reporters do speak English as a second language, but that doesn't seem to negatively affect their coverage. The videography is just fine. There's nothing to criticize, really. They air their raw tape.
I was asked to move. I moved over here, and now they're arresting me.
I don't know. I mean, a lot of what they do, a lot of what they do and a lot of what I do is so similar in the sense that it's low budget, I think. They'll do an interview and maybe illustrate it. They'll air their tape raw. I mean, I don't think they got any of these ideas from me, but we're both doing the same MO of sort of stripped down television. But still, their TV looks so much, infinitely better than anything you would have seen out of Russia 20 years ago. And again, this is not just a Soviet or communistic issue, because almost all around the world, television looked awful, back in the day. But now foreign television looks really good. Al Jazeera is another example. Al Jazeera is not primarily for American consumption, but again, you have a lot of ESL reporters who just do a fantastic job. They're doing far better than people who speak English as a first language in the U.S. Even Press TV is pretty watchable. That's the official Iranian channel. Anyway, I think some of this just represents an evolution in foreign countries. It's just the world is catching up with the United States, and as Peter Schiff has said, someday it's going to decouple from the U.S. caboose that's slowing it down. We're starting to see that process now in a journalistic sense. I guess we're also seeing it in a manufacturing sense to some extent, although actually I've heard that problem is a little overrated. Just some thoughts. In a way, it's a reason for hope. It means there's a lot of media out there that's coming online that the feds can't control because it's overseas and it's backed by nuclear powers in some cases. Nuclear powers I don't really like very much, but I'll tell you what, when you look at RT, they are not abusing their power very much. This is when I object to all tax expenditures, even if it's in foreign countries, but with the occasional exception, I have to respect what they're producing. I just hope a lot more foreign media outlets come online that are focused on American rights. It's purely selfish, of course, but we're definitely going to need it. I was so happy for the Russians when they came back into the world in 1991, 92. And, at the time, I thought, they're not going to be a real nice superpower or power or whatever they are. They're not going to be a normal democracy. They're not going to be Western. But they're going to be Russian again. They weren't allowed to be that, really, under the Soviets. And, but my expectations have been exceeded. Something I hadn't thought about, too. Even under the Soviets, the Russians did make an effort to draw attention to certain human rights concerns in the U.S. Back in the 80s, I think a lot of Soviet citizens knew about the case of Leonard Peltier. I hope I'm saying his name right. It actually be Leonard Peltier. Now, he was, I think, an AIM activist, American Indian Movement, something along those lines, accused of killing 2 FBI agents. There were some questions as to whether he did it, and no one in the U.S. seemed to know who he was back in the late 80s, but everyone in the Soviet Union did. So that broken clock was right that one time that day. The Peltier case is complicated. I don't understand everything about it, but I don't think that he got a fair trial from what I understand. Obviously, he did what he was accused of. That's bad, but they were at least drawing attention to the process and the flaws in the process in the United States.
Bitcoins, the world's first practical internet cash. A nightmare for governments to try and control. Inflation and counterfeit resistant. They return you some control over your money and a new measure of anonymity. A lot cheaper to use than PayPal. You can use them to buy tax-free cigarettes and almost anything else. I accept Bitcoins. So can you. Get started at WeUseCoins.com.